routines and the first big groups. During the transition from foraging to farming in the region around Urfa where Göbekli Tepe is located, archaeologists are unsure about the nature of the groups people belong to. When groups coalesced When groups coalesce at sacred sites, did they form a single community, or were these gatherings composed of diverse tribes with distinct groups alignments? It is possible, for example, that each of the mighty stone slabs erected at Göbekli served as a totem for a different group, each associated with its own god or ancestral founder, and that the very act of creating monoliths could have been conducted competitively, each tribe seeking to outdo the others in displays of strength and cooperative capacity as an expression of local pride and dominance or prestige in intergroup rivalry. But whatever the details of these cultural groups, they were likely small scale and localized. Although monoliths similar to those at Göbekli Tepe could be found not far away, suggesting that their creators participated in a common cultural system, anyone traveling further afield will have found stelae that looked quite different. Stelae.
Stele.
Stele. Anyone traveling further afield will have found stelae that looked quite different, as well as regions that had none at all. Not only were the geographical bounds of the culture quite limited, but they also faded over time. Archaeologists once thought that the cultural groups responsible for the T-shaped monoliths died out, only to be replaced much later by cultural systems spreading into the region from elsewhere. But recent discoveries suggested a different story. Findings from Tel Halula in northern Syria point to continuities between the peoples of early Neolithic Urfa who created the city at Göbekli and the cultural systems that are visible in the archaeological record much later. This suggests that the cultural systems that eventually prevailed in the region surrounding Göbekli were not suddenly transported there from afar, but evolved slowly through the efforts of Göbekli's descendants. Although the precise details of this process remain obscure, it is clear that groups sharing a common culture became very much larger over time. The distinctive pottery designs and stamp seals of the Halaf period encompass not only the region of Turkey in which the cultural system at Göbekli once flourished, but huge regions of what are now Syria and Iraq as well. What changed? How did very localized cultural groups evolve into much larger ones sharing the same norms, rituals, customs, hairstyles, stories, and culinary traditions? My own answer to this question once again has its origins in my time in East New Britain, Papua New Guinea. Prior to the arrival of colonial administrations and missionaries in the 19th century, the peoples of East New Britain were living in cultural groups that were no larger than those of Urfa's Neolithic prehistory, and perhaps much smaller. Many of the languages of the region were mutually intelligible, and relations between the speakers of those different tongues, tongue, 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 were often precarious and potentially violent. Elders in the villages where I lived told me that their encounters commonly led to ritualistic beheadings and cannibalism. In some cases, the more highly organized groups took captive from smaller-scale groups as slaves or unwilling brides. Even among those who spoke the same language, albeit, perhaps adopting distinct dialects, warfare and raiding was at least as likely to occur as peaceful tradings or intermarriage. I was particularly interested in the form that ritual took in these societies. As we saw in the last chapter, I had become preoccupied with the way the warriors in these groups were bound together by painful and grueling ritual ordeals. Crucially, though, these rituals took place quite irregularly. Even the most frequently occurring collective rituals happened only occasionally. For example, to celebrate a major festival or communal achievement. These relatively rare events were major highlights in the ritual calendar, often accompanied by feasting, dancing, and singing. Was this also the way in which sporadic rituals functioned at ancient sites like Göbekli? And if so, what impact would these have had on the scale and structure of cultural groups? I argued in chapter 3 that infrequently performed rituals forge especially strong bonds between their participants. These occasional, emotionally intense moments become defining features in our memories, helping to fuse personal and group identities together. The groups formed in this way tend to be relatively small-scale and localized, even if to the casual case causal. Even if to a casual observer they have some cultural practices in common with neighboring communities, such as food preferences or architectural styles, each group's most potent symbols of identity are strikingly distinct. For example, though the great monoliths at Göbekli are shaped like a letter T, settlements a little further away at Kanyonu, Quemestere, and Kusirhoyuk had stone monoliths but without that distinctive shape. It is possible that people living quite close by had very different cultural traditions, perhaps knowing about each other's monoliths but nevertheless insisting on doing things differently. Likewise, many of the distinct groups living in New Britain differentiated themselves from their neighbors by performing highly idiosyncratic versions of the otherwise quite similar types of rituals. For example, many mining communities perform distinct fire dances where initiated warriors wore highly elaborate masks and hurled themselves into the flames, while large groups of men beat out rhythms with lamps of bamboo and sang together at the tops of their voices. But each group had distinctive masks and its own rhythm and songs, distinguishing itself from all others. The secret stories, myths, and the symbols that lay behind these traditions were all highly localized, specific to the groups that sustained them. The ancient foraging peoples of Earth are just like more recent generations of indigenous tribes in East New Britain, who no doubt have taken pride in the specialness of their own local communities, celebrating their differences and perhaps downplaying similarities. In New Guinea, the roots of these cultural differences originated in small innovations as groups split off and spread across the landscape. Small innovations as groups split off and spread across the landscape. Minor departures from the script often went unnoticed, but the further you got from the place where the tradition began, the more your version of it would become of a copy, each deviating slightly further from the original. Every performance of a ritual in every telling of a myth carries the risk of marbling and forgetting. The risk of
Garbling and forgetting. As each group tries out slightly new versions of its existing stock of rituals, it introduces small deviations which, over time, eventually lead to great diversity of ritual groups across the landscape, a kind of patchwork quite quilt of local traditions. Patchwork quilt of local traditions, like those to be found in regions like Papua New Guinea. All these changed dramatically with the arrival of Catholic missions, among other Christian denominations, to East New Britain, which insisted on much more regular forms of worship. The Roman Catholic Church rapidly established standardized version of the Eucharist, baptism, communion, confession, prayers, hymns, doctrines, and narratives that were nearly identical not only in New Guinea villages but across the dizzying variety of countries spread around the globe. They were carried out in similar-looking social settings in Latin America, Ireland, Eastern Europe, India, China, and who knows where else, week in and week out. How did Catholicism manage to turn the manifold rituals of the East New Britain? The manifold rituals of East New Britain into a single standardized form of worship, mirroring practices being carried out in churches thousands of miles away. Clearly, part of the explanation of this standardization is that the Roman Catholic tradition is highly organized, with an elaborated ecclesiastic hierarchy. Ecclesiastic hierarchy regulated centrally from the Vatican. Another part of it is that the beliefs and practices that devout church-going Catholics should carry out have been inscribed in texts, many of which have venerable histories and are regarded as sacrosanct. A sacrosanct. A sacrosanct.
Sacrosanct.
Sacrosanct. However, there is also a less obvious reason why such religions have become standardized across huge populations scattered over vast territories. That reason is routinization. Routinization refers to the continual repetition of beliefs and practices on a daily or weekly basis. In pre-missionary New Guinea, rituals were infrequent and emotionally intense. With the arrival of Catholicism, however, some key elements of ritual life became more frequent and less intense. They became routinized. On the face of it, routinization may seem very puzzling. Have you ever wondered why the most globally widespread religions? The most globally widespread religions require their adherents to attend temples, synagogues, mosques, churches, and other sacred buildings to carry out precisely the same procedures day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year. This is a peculiar state of affairs if you are seated in a pew in any Catholic pew. If you are seated in a pew in any Catholicism. Catholicism. In any Catholic church, on any given Sunday morning, anywhere in the world, you find yourself chanting phrases and repeating actions that you have previously performed on so many occasions in the past that you know them all by heart. You're not learning anything new by doing these things, and it is hard to fathom why the God to whom these behaviors are directed should need things to be repeated so many times. Surely God, especially one considered to be omniscient, omnipresent, omniscient, especially one considered to be omniscient, would not need to hear the same old prayers and hymns over and over. From a practical perspective, the behavior seems quite redundant both from the perspective of the actor and the intended recipient. Worse still, such frequent repetition might reasonably be said to impoverish any sense of spontaneity or sincerity in the act of worship. That is, the extraordinary familiarity of the routines makes it somewhat inevitable that many worshippers will carry them out of autopilot without any need for conscious reflection or engagement, but in fact this kind of extreme repetition is anything but redundant. While routinized rituals might seem like a waste of time and resources, they are actually one of the most extraordinarily potent forms of social control ever invented by human groups. Routinization does several consequential things. Firstly, it turns us into extreme conformists. In Chapter 1, I explained that we copy people more fastidiously when we think that the behavior in question has no instrumental function whatsoever. When we adopt what I call the ritual stance, it is hard to imagine a more potent signal of this than the requirement that you repeat the same actions and chant the same words over and over, way beyond the point of redundancy. So, one effect of routinization is that it promotes more faithful observance of tradition. Secondly, it makes us less reflective and therefore more susceptible to authoritative pronouncements. The more frequently we conform to a ritual script, the more automatic and habitual the behavior becomes, and the less we reflect on how to carry out the procedures in question, the less we think about why we are doing them at all. This makes us more susceptible to being told what they mean and accepting this without thinking critically for ourselves. This too is an important foundation for establishing very high levels of standardization in the belief system and low levels of innovation and independent thinking. All this may sound like a bad thing. In a culture that values individualism, creativity, and thinking for ourselves, routinized ritual and conformism Conformism. The routinized ritual and conformism may seem highly undesirable, but this formula has proven to be unremarkably useful to human groups over the course of world history. Indeed, I will agree that the appearance and spread of more routinized rituals opened the door to cooperation in much bigger societies. Why? Because it makes it possible to stabilize cultural traditions across large populations and territories. I first began to understand how this works in practice when I considered the impact of routinization on the religious culture of the Bainin and their neighbors. The power of routinization to unify rural peoples came as huge revelation to followers of the Kivon, the new religious movement I was spending most of my time studying. For anyone joining the Kivon for the first time, one of the most striking consequences was that it required participation in an extremely frequent round of rituals. Indeed, it was so time-consuming and labor-intensive that people frequently talked about the work of the Kivon as if it were equivalent to a full-time job. For many followers of the movement, that was no exaggeration. Laying out offerings, performing rituals to achieve catharsis and absolution, cleaning the graves of the dead, meeting to discuss issues of the morality, theology, and cosmology. All these activities were organized around cycles of daily, twice weekly, fortnightly, and monthly repetition according to a strictly enforced schedule. To ensure that everyone knew when it was time to perform another crucial ritual, a gong will be struck repeatedly through each day. A gong. What is a gong?
Gong.
Gong.
A gong will be struck repeatedly through each day to summon people from their gardens, cash crops, and domestic duties. The gong might be any kind of object capable of creating loud noise, from a traditional slate drum to a discarded metal cooking pot, if available. Where I happen to live, the village gong was the shell of a large bomb from the Second World War that had been found in the forest and was now suspended from the tree in the center of the village. While I was collecting life history from Kivon followers, they would often tell me how impactful the new routinized lifestyle had been for them and how they had expanded their social universe. When people first joined the Kivon, they were initially daunted by the demands they would make on their time. Many were unwilling to make that sacrifice and decided not to take part, but often villages joined up as entire communities, and it was harder to avoid following the herd. Having joined, however, people realized that they could now travel to scores of other villages across the region they had never visited before and find themselves welcome there, treated hospitably, and invited to participate in the same rituals that had become familiar at home. These made it possible to develop greatly expanded networks of acquaintances in ways that brought social, material, and other benefits, even in communities that spoke different languages and would traditionally have been regarded as enemies. Thus, the Kivon unified thousands of peoples in an unprecedented way, and it was able to do so precisely because its high-frequency rituals. Never before in this region of Papua New Guinea had it been possible to create such a common system of beliefs and practices across such a wide region, and to unite it under the banner of a single identity. The system supported the emergence of the first imagined community. Groups too large for their individual members to know each other personally. Think of your own countries, for example. That is a meaningful group categories for most people living today, but you couldn't possibly know all its members, and so in a sense it is a community of imagined others, rather than the flesh and blood persons you could point to more concretely. The introduction of routinized rituals to Kivon villages in 1960s had an almost instantaneous effect on the unification of various previously fragmented villages and language groups in the region. In time, this newfound shared identity also became a powerful force in elections, enabling Kivon-backed politicians to gain seats in both national and regional assemblies. And these new forms of political alignment persisted, remaining strong in the 1980s when I carried out field work there. But these time periods are minuscule compared with the many thousands of years it took for our ancient ancestors to discover the unifying power of high-frequency collective rituals. For most of human prehistory, unification via routinization was an unimaginable idea, in much the same way as writing, which will arrive later. Still, both will eventually allow human culture to be stored and spread in a more stable form than ever before. This process was only able to unfold so quickly in Papua New Guinea because Christianity and its techniques of schooling and regular worship provided a ready-made blueprint for the creation of routinized rituals. My experience in East New Britain made me wonder whether the routinization of ritual had played a similar role in ancient societies. Was the invention of routinized ritual a key force in the emergence of the first large-scale communities? As it turned out, this was not a straightforward question to answer. We know now routinized rituals and their consequences were introduced to the people of Papua New Guinea thanks to extensive documentation of the efforts of Christian missions. A far greater challenge was to figure out how routinization was invented in the midst of prehistory and how its consequences were discovered and exploited by ancient societies, long before their beliefs and practices could be written down. If routinization was indeed a driving force in the emergence of the first large-scale societies, how might we tell?